Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. Redditors who have been declared legally dead, but then brought back. What do you remember? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was buried alive in Mexico when I was 7 years old. We were digging tunnels in a sand wall on the beach. It rained the night before, so the sand was a little wet. It all collapsed. Most kids were buried up to their knees, neck, and ankles. My stepbrothers thought that my twin sister was lying when she said I came with them that day. They couldn't remember and kept telling her I stayed at home. Before we left the house that day, my sister told me randomly to yell her name, Ashley, if anything happened, and she would hear me. So I remember the tunnel I was working on collapsing, hyperventilating while over my dad's shoulders, Ashley passing out, seeing the white light, more darkness, and waking up over my dad's shoulders. My sister says she heard me screaming. She ran home and got my dad. My dad got all the neighbors. They were digging with shovels. My dad made them use their hands after a while so they wouldn't hurt me. They found me literally 6 feet under. I was coughing at the time of the collapse, so I had no sand in my lungs because I was covering my mouth. They found my hands sticking up above my body first because I was throwing sand out of my tunnel. My twin sister saw me, and I was blue. My stepmother attempted CPR. The ambulance came and couldn't find a pulse. They used a defibrillator and brought me back to life. I'm now 25, totally fine, left the hospital that day, pregnant with a healthy baby boy, and I love my twin sister more than anybody in the world. Almost 10 years ago, I was in a really rough place. I was extremely depressed, dealing with thoughts of suicide. I was heavily medicated on 4 different types of antidepressants and mood stabilizers, as the doctors called them. This was also during a time where you could fill a 3-month prescription. It was just a few days after I got a refill. I cannot remember what caused me to say F it, but I said F it, and I swallowed every last pill those bottles contained. And I waited thinking that it would be, really quick. After about 15 minutes and just feeling really stoned, that survival instinct kicked in, and I called up my friend asking him to take me to the hospital and told him what I did. I did not want to call an ambulance because I had my sister home and I didn't want her to know what I did. So I get to the hospital and they instantly take me in. They made me drink charcoal, I believe. It was this black, disgusting drink. And the last thing I saw was some of my closest friends at the door in tears, and then I blacked out. I went into a coma, and during that I ended up vomiting and I couldn't expel it all. So a large majority of it got in my lungs, which stopped me from breathing, and then stopped my heart for 5 minutes. Somehow the doctors managed to get my heart beating again, but I remained on life support for another 2 days afterwards while still in a coma, and during that time I couldn't move, speak, or even open my eyes. I was completely trapped in darkness and felt like I was choking. After I woke up, I found out the reason I felt like I was choking was because I was still on life support, but my lungs were finally able to start breathing on their own. So long story short, I was trapped in my own body, surrounded by darkness, with only the memory I had of seeing my closest friends crying. There was nothing, just a black void. It happened during my first C-section. I was lying there talking with my husband, waiting to hear our baby girl's first cry when I started to feel strange. I felt warm and my vision started to get fuzzy around the edges. I blinked my eyes a few times to see if that would clear my vision, but it did not. All of a sudden, it was like someone turned the volume up, and I could hear my heart monitor perfectly clear. As I'm lying there, I notice that the space between my heartbeats is becoming more and more spaced out. Then I hear my husband asking me if I'm okay. He just kept saying, "Baby, are you okay?" over and over. I could not answer him, though. I felt paralyzed. A few minutes before, I had only been numb from the chest down. So I'm just looking up at the ceiling and noticed the black started creeping in on my vision. I got this overwhelming feeling and knew this was it. I was never going to get to hear my baby girl's first cry, never hold her or watch her grow up. I would never get to see my husband again. Then I felt tears rolling down the side of my face. By this time, my vision was almost completely gone. My husband leaned over and wiped my tears and kissed my forehead, then squeezed my hand. I still felt paralyzed, but somehow managed to squeeze his hand back. After that, I slowly faded out to darkness. Now, up to this point, it felt as if time had slowed considerably, then it sped up. It felt like I was only out for a second before I snapped awake, like when you fall asleep on accident and then jerk awake. That's exactly what it felt like. I could see normally, and the noise around me was back to a normal level. I could also feel the parts of my body that were not numbed due to the spinal block. After that, everything went fine. My baby girl was born, and I had to stay in recovery for 3 hours to monitor for my blood pressure. My doctor said that I had a bad reaction to the combination of drugs that were put into my spinal block, and I was on my way to a flatline. My husband later told me that after I squeezed his hand, a nurse took him out of the hallway, and he was out there for almost 10 minutes before they let him come back in. He said I was just starting to wake up when he came back in. For me, it seemed like just a few seconds between being out and being awake. I had 4 other surgeries and have had issues with my blood pressure every time. Never as bad as the first time, though. The doctors and nurses were more prepared given my history. I had just been brought into the ER for a seizure and was being seen by the doctor. It was the first time anyone had witnessed me having a seizure, though in hindsight, probably not the first seizure I had, so no one really knew what to expect. The doctor was concerned that I would have another seizure, so she started me on an IV dose of something, don't remember what it's called and probably should, and told me to let a nurse know if I started to feel any symptoms of an allergic reaction. Only a few moments later, it started to feel like I was burning up from the inside. There was just this overwhelming heat, and I managed to get the attention of a nearby nurse just as my throat began to swell shut. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed on an inpatient floor. I'd had a bad allergic reaction to the medication and was clinically dead for about a minute before they brought me back. I didn't regain consciousness right away, so I'd already been admitted by the time I woke up. Being dead didn't feel like anything. I was tired and confused when I woke up, but it didn't feel like I had been asleep. It just felt unreal, like I'd blinked and teleported from the ER to inpatient ward. Very strange experience. I've actually had 2 experiences. One was a drug overdose, and one I'm not proud of. I'd grown up with severe asthma, and at 12 I had an extremely bad allergic reaction to black mold in our house. We lived in a small town, a town with a hospital that barely had the capability to dispense bandages. After about 30 minutes of being on a constant breathing treatment and getting progressively worse, I sat in the ER and a wave of physical and mental exhaustion washed over me. The nurses were more panicked than I was and failed multiple attempts to start an IV. As I fought to stay awake, I grabbed my mother's hand and begged her to not let me fall asleep. From what was told to me, I crashed almost instantly afterwards. The attending doctor sprung into action and made all the right decisions to keep my feeble body going. I was quickly life-flighted to a children's hospital in my state's capital. I'm not sure of the time from my crash to regaining consciousness, but when I came to, I had IV lines coming from numerous places in my body and a tube in my airway that assisted my breathing. The faces that loomed over me were almost the scariest part. But I felt a state of calm. I saw my mom, and through sign language I told her I was okay and that I loved her. I thanked the nurses and whoever else were there for saving me, and the tube in my throat was uncomfortable. Thankfully, one of the nurses knew enough sign language to translate. After the tube was removed and about a day of letting my vocal cords recover, I had a conversation with my dad, who had roughly 11 years of medical experience at the time, about what had happened. I told him there was nothing. I'd truly felt nothing. No light, no warmth, no voices on the other side. And although I hadn't figured it out at the time, I eventually learned solace from that. I know now that the calm I felt, despite having a tube forcing air into my lungs and enough IVs that made me look like Neo's rebirth from the pod in the Matrix, there was a sense of calm and relief in death. Especially after my overdose later in life, I've grown to not fear death. I'll welcome death when the time comes, whenever that may be. But both times I felt nothing. There was no other side for me. I just know that I'll continue on in the universe in a different way. 12-year-old me got tangled up in the hammock on our porch, and it wrapped around my neck. I was out within seconds. I had a very vivid dream vision, of fighting my way through a tunnel. A very large diameter tunnel with smaller tunnels in its sides would produce various opponents. Some I would engage with, but most I would evade and race past. It was very much like a Dungeons and Dragons type encounter, but it was very much plain old me as the main character. No equipment or enhancements. I don't remember many details, but the tunnel was lighter in the direction I was heading, and I did feel like it was a goal I needed to reach. At some point, my mom came looking for me. Lucky for me, it happened just before dinner time. She was able to cut me loose and call an ambulance. No idea of the order of events or time frame, but it was a house way out in the boons. It had to have taken a while for the ambulance to get there. I remember the EMTs reviving me and struggling to say my name for them, and then blacked out again. I briefly came to the emergency room where there was an intense pain in my groin. I felt like they were giving me a shot in one of my testicles, but I'm not sure if that's actually what was happening. Then I woke up the next day feeling very weak with a rope burn around my neck that took almost 2 months to fade away. Had to stay at the hospital for 3 days if I recall correctly, and the doctors were testing a lot of signs of brain damage since I went to an unknown amount of time with no oxygen intake. It came out okay on that, but it still screwed me up in the long run. Nerve damage and structural damage in my neck have left me with chronic pain issues. Some days I wish it would have ended then and spared me decades of pain, but there's so much I've seen and done that I can look and be thankful for that. Those days are pretty rare. I had pneumonia really badly. Christmas Day 1984, I went to the hospital. I remember struggling very hard to breathe, and suddenly it felt like it was effortless and felt a floating feeling. I felt like I was rising up to this point that opened up in the room, and in this rift I could see 3 angels just because I don't know what else to call them. One was large and 2 were small. Even though the small ones didn't seem like kids either, they were welcoming and soothing, more like giving off those vibes than doing or saying anything. I got scared and quickly snapped my head around, and I could see the room from above and see my mom running to get help. I said, "No," and snapped back into my body. I regretted it almost right away, as breathing was so painful. Then there were about 2 days I remember nothing. They put tubes down my throat and knocked me out, basically. I went home 2 weeks later. I tried to tell some people what I experienced, and they only made fun of me, so I don't tell anyone anymore. I mean, all these stories are equal parts, scary, and some bit of comfort. It's nice to see some people have their views and feelings on it, and that there are some various experiences, so thanks for sharing, everybody. I was at a beach with my relatives when I was little. I forgot the exact age, but probably 6 or 7. This was my first time being at a beach, so I was excited. My cousins decided that since we were at the beach, it wouldn't be a problem for them to dip in the water a bit. They went in with just underwear since they didn't bring their swimwear. Since I wanted to fit in with my cousins, I decided to join them. But due to my height and my inability to swim adequately, I was put on a tube while my cousins watched over me. It was going great until a much older cousin, a young adult at the time, decided to have a little fun. He decided that I should taste the salt water a bit and leaped on top of the tube I was on. Thankfully, he didn't directly make contact with me, just the tube. However, his action was so sudden that I didn't expect it. Air was knocked out of me, and the instant I hit the water, I desperately fought for air. I tried to float and grasp for anything to no avail. I drank so much water in a short time that I became nauseated. At some point, I kind of accepted whatever was going to happen to me before some figure appeared before my blurry vision. It didn't really look like anyone I knew, but after I saw the figure, I kind of passed out. As for the conclusion of the event, all I recall is that I woke up on a beach towel. My mom was sleeping next to me, so I shook her out of her sleep and asked what happened to me. I told her about how I was about to drown and whatnot, but apparently she saw me walk simply out of the water and lie down next to her. As for me, I don't remember doing any of that, so it became a mystery to me. Since I'm assuming you're talking about near-death experiences, I've had that taken to me before. When I was around 12, I got really, really sick. I don't remember what exactly I had. I'd have to ask my mother, and we don't really talk very often. Whatever it was, my body felt super cold, like I was in a freezer or something, and I was shaking so violently that I remember a nurse offhand mentioning that I might need to be restrained. I won't get into the gritty details, but in that moment, I'm not sure if I actually legally died, but breathing got so hard that I lost consciousness and suddenly I felt really warm. Then I realized I was floating above my body and I could see everything that was happening around me. I saw my parents, the doctors, and I could move around freely, even moving through walls. The craziest thing about it was that I flew down the hall toward the cafeteria where my older brother was because I wanted to see him one last time. Around this time, I felt like I was being pulled upward like a magnet was drawing my upwards. Everything around me started to fade to black as I rose up toward the classic light at the end of the tunnel. When I was a kid, I was always afraid of dying. Sometimes even thinking about the idea of dying would make me start crying. Yet in this moment I wasn't afraid anymore, and I accepted what was going to happen. When I got closer to the light, something came up in front of me. I can't describe what it was like, almost like a cloaked figure, although the material of the cloak was translucent and shiny, and there was nothing underneath it. It spoke to me and told me that there was a mistake and that it wasn't my time yet. I then felt a falling sensation, like when you're having a dream where you're falling, and then your body moves and reacts as if it's actually falling. That happened to me and I woke up. The craziest thing about it is that, like many others who have experienced this phenomenon, almost immediately my condition started to improve, and I was able to go home later that night. NDEs in general have always interested me. They're kind of like the compensation for almost dying. Sometimes I wonder what it's actually like beyond the light, and why the cloaked figure sent me back. After my tonsillectomy, my surgeon told me in 2 weeks the scabs would fall off the back of my throat, and it was normal to spit up about a cup of blood. Any more than that, and 911 would need to be called. But he's never had that happen to any of his patients, so not to worry. Well, it happened to me. I could go into more detail, but to get to the point, they decided to keep me overnight just to be safe. During the middle of the night, they woke me up to take my blood pressure. I just remember the nurse asking how I felt, and barely being able to tell her, "Very tired, I want to sleep now." She told me I could go back to sleep after she took my blood pressure, hooked me up to the machine, couldn't read me. She tried, but couldn't either. She couldn't find my pulse, and called in another nurse who got a handwritten reading of something like 70/40. Needless to say, a blood transfusion was done. I believe I was already on oxygen, but I don't remember clearly. I remember feeling very relaxed and tired, just wanting to close my eyes for a little bit longer, but also having that bit in the back of my head saying, "Stay awake," but now that I think about it, that might have been the nurse shrug. Cardiac arrest last year, 19th of July. I had less than 15% chance of coming back, and my brain was not getting oxygen for around 11 minutes. I can't imagine the hell I put the hospital staff through to be able to successfully revive me with such grim odds, but I sadly don't remember a single vivid memory for the next 3+ days. I got visitors from all around the province, family, friends, and co-workers. They all shared their stories of how their visit turned out, and apparently I was totally out of it. My mom says I was urging her to go get Big Macs or McDonald's for some odd reason. My brother said I gave him strict orders to go take all my gaming shit for himself while I recovered in the hospital, and my sister says I tried to leave the hospital so I could go get to work, that my shift had started 2 hours ago, and I needed to help the restaurant. It took 6 hospital staff to keep me down, and then I got drugged up and transported via helicopter to Vancouver General Hospital, where I finally got off of autopilot and regained control of my consciousness. At that point, we're 4 days into recovery, and I'm still trying to grasp what has happened and whether or not I'm still employed. It took a while to settle in, but after I was debriefed, I sat there in recollection, wondering if I'd get to live an ordinary life again. The extreme amount of trauma I just went through left me dazed. I could still function the same as before, but I refused to acknowledge the reasons that led me up to my accident. I spent no more than a week getting tests done and being monitored before I was released. During that time, I carried out my daily routines as I would pre-accident. Nothing to this day, as far as my memory goes, has returned to me pertaining to the descriptions of my visitors' stories. If it weren't for life support keeping me alive and regulating my circulatory system, those blanked out memories might have been recovered, and I'd be at a complete loss for life. My experience with death is exactly as you'd imagine. Everything is gone now that you're dead, and there is nothing beyond this life that you can find sanctuary in.